So I will be handovering the session for Alif because he is the master of space law here. Please.
Yeah. So thank you, Bang Manyu. You already know me, lah. You don't have to. You don't have to greet me like that, but thank you. So today, as I have been informing you since 2 weeks ago and last week as well, we are going to have a guest lecture. Now, for some of you who are currently taking the Air and Space Law class for the international law program, you might have heard the name of our lecturers today. She's the author of the Introduction to Space Law, the book that you'll be using for this semester, and maybe if you're doing your thesis in space law for the rest of your study. And for those of you who are currently taking the international class, we are currently giving you some insights today about space law because as you may have read in your curriculums that this week and next week will be covering the subjects of territory, but not all territory are situated inside of national jurisdiction. Some territories are also situated outside of national jurisdiction, and one of that territory is the outer space. I'm also welcoming the Dean of the Law School, Pak Edmond. Yeah. Thank you, Pak Edmond, for greeting the class. Maybe before we begin, I would like to invite Pak Edmond to give one or two greetings to our guest lecturer today. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Thank you very much, Professor, for your kindness to welcome to Universitas Indonesia, Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. Actually, we are the eldest Faculty of Law in Indonesia. We established since 1924. At that time, we still under colonial, Netherlands colonial, Rijkshogeschool School in Batavia. And after our independence, this school transformed to Universitas Indonesia. And we are now in pursuing to 100 years, because in these years we are 98. And we are very proud that you come to us and will deliver public lectures. It's an honor to us, and hopefully Floor will take some many advantage from your lectures. I don't have too many words, yeah, because now I receive guests in my room. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, welcome in Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Edmond, for the greetings. And so, without further ado, I will invite Professor Tanya Masonzuan, who is currently the Professor of Space Law from Leiden University. Yeah. Okay. Souvenirs, sure.
This our standard give you 7 minutes first before lecturing. This is my name.
Thank you so much.
Okay, now we are getting back to the lecture. Without further ado, I will invite Professor Tanya Masonzuan from Leiden University, Professor of Air and Space Law from the Institute of Air and Space Law. Please. Yeah.
Thank you, Alif. Yeah. Do we put our
Yeah, I will put the slide.
PowerPoint?
Yeah.
I use that as a clicker. Yeah. Okay, super. Okay, so very nice to be here, and thank you, Alif, for inviting me and for organizing this lecture. Also, hello to those who are online. I believe some of the students are also following this. So this is what we used to call hybrid lecture, but it's very nice to see such a big audience here in the room during my visit in Jakarta, being back in Jakarta, because I've been here several times. So who of you has already studied some space law? Anyone? It's all new. Who would like to study space law? So I'll ask this again after the class and see if you have changed your mind. So yes, I am Tanja Masson-Zwaan. I am from the Netherlands. I work at Leiden University, where we have a program and an institute on air law and space law. And so Alif was my student a few years ago. He did very well. And we generally have quite a few students from Indonesia who come to our program to study a year in Leiden and learn about this exciting branch of international law, because a lot is happening in space and we need lawyers. And we also need lawyers from countries like yours, like Indonesia, which has special interest in space as an archipelagic country, has special interest to preserve and to also be part of this new economic capability, and to it will bring a lot of benefits, but we need also the people to take care of the legal aspects. So what I will do is to give you a few, let's say, a bird's eye view of what space law is about. I'll tell a little bit about how it all came about and what are the main elements of space law, and also go a little bit into the current challenges, because there's so much happening in space that need legal answers, which we don't always have. As you will see, I may raise more questions than I can answer them. By the way, if anyone would like to answer a question, please let me know. I'm happy to take any now or at the end, whatever is preferable. So let me just check if I go backward or forward. No. I use the mouse, it may be easier. For this. So I'll just use this then. No? Is this forward? This is forward. No, this one. Yes. Okay. So how did it all start? And I can see my slides there also. So of course, the space age as we know it is not very old yet. It all started on the 4th of October, 1957. That was the first time when a satellite went into an orbit around the Earth and made a full orbit, made a full circle while floating in Earth. And you see it on the picture, the satellite with the three antennas. That is Sputnik 1. And that was launched by the Soviet Union in 1957. And that really started the space age, or we also call it the space race, because it was very much a race between the USSR and the USA in those early days. So the Russians were the first to have an object in space. They won that part of that race, but they also won another part of that race, namely to have the first human in space. And that was Yuri Gagarin. Maybe you know him. He was going into space in 1961 on the 12th of April. And also 2 years later, the Russians had the first woman who went into outer space. Does anyone know what her name is? Yuri Gagarin, mostly people know it, but the first woman, you're looking it up on Google. See how quick you can find it.
Valentina Tereshkova.
Exactly, Valentina Tereshkova. So she was the first woman in outer space in 1963. Then the Americans won the next step because they were the first to have a person on another planet, and that was on the moon, on our moon of our Earth, and that was in 1969 in July. And so that was Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, who were the first of the men on the moon. They were all men. Do you know how many there were? How many men have been on the moon ever? What would you say? 10, 50, 100? What range of number would you put it? 12, actually. Only 12 people have been outside of the Earth to another celestial body, as we call it. So it's really very few. And the last one to be there was in 1972, way before you were all born. So very long time we haven't been back. So space is hard, space is difficult, but we're surely going back there. And now the United States has new programs back to the moon with the Artemis program, the Apollo missions, that was the missions of America in the first age when we went to the moon in the 1960s, 70s. And now the program is called Artemis, also because Artemis is the sister of Apollo. And the United States would now like to bring a first woman to the moon and also the first person of color. And so that is really the program to bring humankind back to the moon and also do that with other countries, with international partners. So there may also be the first European on the moon, or one day the first Indonesian on the moon. Why not? So that was very much USA and Russia. And then several years later, quite a few years later, China joined the capability of sending humans into outer space in 2003. And about 10 years later, also the first woman who you see on that picture there. And so as soon as that first satellite went up, states came together and they said, we have to make some rules to make this activity to run it in safety and peacefully, because of course this was the end of the Cold War. We had just had a big war all over the world, and this new realm, this new frontier for humankind was going to be discovered, but we needed to make sure that we would do it in a peaceful manner. So as soon as Sputnik 1 went up, 1957, as you remember, in 1958, the United Nations created a committee, which is called the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS, as we refer to it, and which became a permanent committee of the UN in 1959. So it is a permanent part of the United Nations that deals with outer space questions. And so there was this political commitment of states to maintain outer space for peaceful purposes, to prevent at all costs a weapons race in outer space. This committee has two subcommittees. One is a legal subcommittee and the other is a scientific and technical subcommittee. And it is in that legal subcommittee that space law is made. So they meet in Vienna. The photo that you see there is at the Vienna International Center in Austria. And that is where UN COPUOS legal subcommittee and scientific and technical subcommittee and the plenary committee meet. So 2 weeks in February, 2 weeks in April, and 10 days in June or so. That is where all these space matters are discussed. Now, in the early days, COPUOS was, of course, mostly managed by Russia and US, and it had about 20 members. Nowadays, it is 100 members, 100 states. So more than half of the UN members, 100 states are members of UN COPUOS. And there are also about 40 permanent observers. Permanent observers can be international organizations like the European Space Agency or APSCO or the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization that perhaps you heard of, or the European Union, or also non-governmental organizations that, for instance, have special interests in space. They can also observe the sessions of the UN. So I always bring students, I don't know if you came, Alif, when we did that, but I always bring my Leiden students to a session of the legal subcommittee to be observers, so you can sit in the back of that room and see how space law is made. Now, one particularity of this committee is that it takes its decisions by consensus. That means, do you know what it means? It is not the same as unanimity. Do you know the difference? When something is adopted by unanimity, it means that everybody says yes. And so it is no one says no or abstains, everybody positively votes yes. But when something is adopted by consensus, there's actually no voting. When something is adopted by consensus, the chair at some point observes in the room that everybody more or less agrees, everybody has said what they don't agree with or has raised their concerns, and then the chair says, okay, I think we have a consensus on this sentence, word. So every word that is in space law is adopted by consensus. And that gives it, of course, great weight, because as soon as you vote about something, if someone votes against it, that weakens the whole agreement. So it may take a long time before you can adopt something by consensus, but it is very strong. So that is a particularity of UN COPOS that was actually also taken over by other parts in international law, such as the law of the sea. So, of course, one important question when you talk about space law is, where does space begin? And the funny thing is, this is one of the examples where I can raise a question, but I cannot answer it, because there is no agreed international boundary between airspace and outer space. There is no definition or delimitation of outer space agreed in any treaty. And that is quite funny, because the regimes are really different. They are based on contrary concepts. In airspace, there is sovereignty. And so we were talking about the territories. That is the topic of your studies. In airspace, you cannot fly over or through the airspace of a foreign country without its express permission. You need the permission of the sovereign state to land in a country, to fly over it, to pick up passengers, and so on. Space, on the other hand, there is no sovereignty. And so anyone can go into space, it's free, no one is the boss. So that is quite a fundamental contradiction between those two regimes. And so you would say we would need to know where one ends and the other begins. But states have not agreed, although this has been on the agenda for decades, really for nearly 50 years, this has been on the agenda of UN COPOS. It is a formal agenda item, but there are some states who don't want a solution to that, because it is convenient to have it a little bit as a gray area and to not know exactly, because then they can interpret it according to their needs of having a little bit more sovereignty or a little bit less sovereignty. So there are states who say it's not necessary to have a boundary. We will know when something is aviation or space. And of course, if you fly a plane, you will fly at about 15 kilometers. If you fly a satellite, it will be at about 200-300 kilometers as the lowest where your satellite will stay in orbit. So that is quite clearly, you can say that's a rocket, that's a plane, right? When you see one, you know what it is. But with the advent of what we call suborbital flights, perhaps you've heard of Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic, or Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin. These guys are flying passengers, paying passengers to 100 kilometers up and down. They don't go into an orbit. They don't stay in an orbit. They go up to 100 kilometers and they go down. So it's like an up and down link. And they say, of course, you're an astronaut. You're paying a lot of money for that, and you can call yourself an astronaut. So they sell this as spaceflight. And that 100 kilometers is about the area where the boundary probably lies somewhere. So they use that as their unique selling point, if you like, for their business. But it is not based on any treaty, neither the Chicago Convention for Civil Aviation, nor the UN Outer Space Treaty that I'll tell you about in a bit, says space begins at 100 kilometers. But there are some states that have put a boundary in their national law, because they say we want this to be clear. And of course, if more and more and more states are going to do that, you could come to the creation of a rule of customary law. If you have enough state practice and opinio juris, some rule of custom might emerge. And I think that this topic will gain in importance because of this activity that takes place in that gray area. We will need some answers because we need to know if we apply air law or space law to those activities. I'll say a bit more about that when I talk about some of the topical cases that are currently in our attention. But let's go back to the basics. So what we have in terms of space law is a number of treaties. We have 5 international treaties. So those are legally binding instruments to which states can access. They can sign and ratify a treaty, and then it becomes binding law. That is what we call hard law. They're legally binding, but only on the states parties who have ratified the treaty, obviously. So the first of those is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. That is the basic treaty setting out the principles of behavior that states must adhere by when they carry out activities in outer space. It's a very short treaty. It's only 17 articles. So you can find it easily on the internet, read it, because then it gives you a nice idea of the coherent approach that was drafted in the 1960s, and gives you a good overview of the principles. I'll run you through a few of them, but obviously I cannot do everything in just a short time that we have available. So based on that first treaty, we have 4 other treaties that deal with some specific topics, such as the rescue of astronauts. What happens if an astronaut crashes on foreign territory or on the high seas? We have to assist them. Or what happens if your satellite crashes and you need to recover pieces of that? That is what the Rescue and Return Agreement does in 1968. And then we have a conventional liability. Of course, this was very much on the minds of the drafters. This is a dangerous activity. It's a new frontier. What happens if something comes down and crashes on my house? Or what happens if my satellite is going to collide with another satellite? Who is going to pay the damage? Who is liable? How do we define the damage? What are the rules of compensation? All that is laid down in the Liability Convention of 1972. Then it was also considered important to know what is up there. And that's why we have the registration agreement. And that is a treaty that says anything that is launched into Earth orbit or beyond has to be registered in a national registry and with the United Nations in a public UN registry. And then we have a last treaty that's called the Moon Agreement. By the way, they all have very long formal names, but I will not bother you with that. And that treaty deals with the use of resources in outer space. So that's also a very topical subject nowadays, because there are companies who would like to go and mine asteroids or find resources on the moon that they will be able to commercialize. How does that work? And the Moon Agreement gives some ideas to govern that and to make some rules about that. So these treaties are very well ratified. The Outer Space Treaty is ratified by 112 states and signed by another 23. So the UN has 193 members. So you see that nearly all states are part of the Outer Space Treaty, somehow connected with it. The next 3 treaties have between 70, 80, 90 states or so as parties, and a number of signatories as well, so are also very well adopted. The Moon Agreement, on the other hand, has much less, because it only has 18 member states. And that is very few. And one of the reasons is that it contains a principle that you will also find in the law of the sea, namely that it says that outer space and its resources are the common heritage of mankind. And that is quite a contentious principle, and it is not always understood. And that's the reason why many states decided not to ratify it. So this is the hard law that we have in space law. In addition to that, but I don't have time to go into that now, you have a number of sets of principles and resolutions that we call soft law, that also deal with specific aspects, such as the use of nuclear power sources, or remote sensing, Earth observation, or how to make sure that states register their satellites, because the practice shows that not all states do that. How can we improve that? Or how do we deal with space debris mitigation? So those are all important topics, and they were all made into principles and resolutions between the 1970s and as late as 2019. The last set of principles was adopted on long-term sustainability of space activities. They never made it into a treaty, so they are not hard law. They are what we sometimes call soft law. So you could say soft law is not law, something's law or it's not law, right? But soft law can become custom, can become binding if everyone behaves like it. And also it can be implemented in national law, and then it can become binding on private parties. And that is something that we see happening in space. Space is now becoming private space activity. It is no longer only the US and Russia. It is no longer only states. You have many newcomer states or latecomers, whatever you want to call it, but you also have a lot of private space activity. I'm sure you've all heard of Elon Musk. And of course, there are many more. But these private actors, of course, are not bound by treaties. They have to be bound by national law. And so these soft law principles that states adopt by consensus, and so even though it's not a treaty, they were adopted by consensus. So that means that they are important, they are agreed, they can also become binding under national law. So that is basically the system of international space law that we have. Just to come back to the Outer Space Treaty, you see there the photo of the signing of the treaty in 1967. And what is interesting is that the title contains the word principles. And that explains that this treaty does not give you all the answers either. This is a treaty of principles. And that means that now that space has become so much more expansive than it was in the 1960s, that we will need additional rules. We will need rules to deal with the congestion. We will need rules to deal with space traffic management. We will need rules to deal with space resource utilization. There are so many new topics that will require rules that were not foreseen. And we will have settlements on Mars. How do we deal with the human settlements living together? So all this will require new rules. It's not done in the Outer Space Treaty, but the Outer Space Treaty does not prohibit or prevent it. So it is a treaty on principles that was very smartly put together. And that is based on major principles of international cooperation, peaceful coexistence, assisting each other, and most importantly, there is no sovereignty in outer space and no one can own outer space, which is what we call the non-appropriation principle. And I'll go into it a bit more. And we have had 50, nearly 60 years now of peaceful coexistence and safe development of space activities, which we all benefit from. You all use your phone for your navigation or for communicating or for using WhatsApp, getting money out of the ATM, looking at the weather forecast, navigating your cars or whatever. So we use space every day and we benefit greatly from it as humanity. And that Outer Space Treaty, that actually I made an error, it's not 111, it's 112 now. And also it is remarkable that no state has ever withdrawn from the treaty. Because in international law, you can say, I don't want to be bound anymore because this treaty is restraining me. Then you give 1 year notice and you can withdraw. No one has ever done that. And no one has ever asked for any amendments. No one has said, this doesn't fit anymore, it is restricting or it is wrongly formulated or whatever. No amendments have ever been proposed. So that is, I think, a compliment to the drafters of the treaties. Do we have any questions so far? Yes.
There was a part slide.
There was, sorry?
There was a part in the previous slide that said it shared 50 years of peaceful and orderly development of what is it, ma'am? I think it was covered by the picture.
Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Peaceful and orderly development of space activities. I think that probably was, sorry, I see the photo goes over the slide. I will correct it and send you a new one. I think I wrote there space activities, probably. Clear?
Thank you.
Anything else so far? If not, I will continue and run you through a few of the principles that I mentioned. So the first and the second one are actually ones that I have already mentioned. Freedom, the outer space is free for exploration and use. That is in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. So you could say it is the primary principle of space law, right? But that freedom of exploration and use is, of course, not absolute. No freedom is absolute. My freedom ends where your freedom starts. So there are certain requirements to exercise that right of free exploration and use. And that is that the exploration and use have to be for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of economic and scientific development, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read it all. And importantly, the exploration and use of outer space are the province of all mankind. What exactly does that mean? We do not really know, but I want you to remember that what Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty says, exploration and use of outer space are the province of all mankind, is not the same as what that Moon Agreement does that I mentioned earlier, that says outer space and its resources are the common heritage of mankind. And it's quite difficult to draw that distinction. It's always difficult to explain it, but when you talk about heritage, when you inherit something, it means someone has owned something and you inherit it, right? There is a sense of ownership in there. And when you talk about the use and exploration are the province of all mankind, I see it more as an obligation to care for it together, that we have to preserve it for humankind. And so the difference is maybe difficult to grasp, but I hope that you see that it is not the same. And I always have students who say outer space is the common heritage of mankind. It's written in the Outer Space Treaty. No, it's not. And the fact that the Moon Agreement says outer space is the common heritage of mankind is the reason why the Moon Treaty was somehow considered as a failed treaty. Okay, so we have that freedom principle, and then we have that non-appropriation principle. That's Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. I promise I won't go through all the articles, but these are just a few principles that I think are important. So even though exploration and use of space are free for all, everyone can use it, no one can own it. So there was a guy, his name was Dennis Hope, and he said, okay, that's in the Outer Space Treaty, but I'm not a state. I'm not bound by that treaty. I'm going to sell pieces of the moon. And so he established a company called Lunar Embassies, and you can find it on the internet, where you can buy a piece of the moon. Costs, I don't know, $20, $30 or something, and you get a nice certificate, and you can tell your family that you own a piece of the moon. But is that legally valid? And he actually built a whole legal page on his website as well. And he became very rich because a lot of people were eager to buy a piece of land on the moon. You know, exciting, fun, only $30. Sure, why not? Maybe one day I will be able to go there. But I'm afraid that if you have already done so, or if you plan to do so, it will not give you legal title to the moon. Because if a state has accepted a certain obligation, it has, of course, to make sure that its legal subjects, Dennis Hope is an American subject, do not frustrate those principles. To give you an extreme example, if the United States says, I will not put a nuclear weapon in outer space, Dennis Hope cannot put a nuclear weapon in outer space just because he's not a state. So you could say the state should act against this and prohibit him from doing that. But then the United States is a free country, free enterprise, and so on. And so the government says, well, if people want to buy that, that's their problem. You could probably sue him for fraud because he's selling you something that he doesn't own. But it is important to remember that no one can own a whole planet, part of a planet, an orbit, outer void space, the sun. There was also a woman who claimed the sun at some point. And I said, well, if I get a sunburn, can I give you a claim for damage? But all those are not valid. And I think that is one of the principles why outer space has remained peaceful and why we have so much benefit from outer space. But of course, this raises the very important question that is on the agenda now. What about the resources? What if we do find helium-3 on the moon or water? We know there's water. Water is fantastic. You can sustain life with water. You can transform it into fuel to go to Mars. Does the non-appropriation principle also mean that you cannot own the resources? Or does it only apply to the real estate, so to say, to the ground? So those are questions. I'll talk about it a bit more, but also questions like, if you have at some point a mining zone on the moon, are you allowed to put a safety zone around it, which would make sense for safety purposes? Or is that also appropriation? Has that safety zone to be limited in time and size? Is it then okay? And you can compare that a little bit to putting satellites in geostationary satellite orbit. And that is an orbit that lies 36,000 kilometers above our heads, and where a satellite remains more or less stationary above the same point on Earth. And there also states put satellites, companies put satellites, and you get a slot. You coordinate with the International Telecommunication Union. You get the right to use, to put your satellite there if you comply with all the rules and the processes, but you don't own it. And so the right to use and an ownership, again, it is a thin line. The use should not be permanent. When does use become ownership? Time will tell and practice will learn, but those are interesting questions that we'll have to solve. International law applies, and that is to ensure that although we have these principles, they do not cover everything, but space law is a part of international law. Space law is a branch of international law, just like air law, law of the sea, all these other criminal law, environmental law. And you have to see international law as a holistic system, not as pillars of law that exist independent of each other. It is a holistic system. And the Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty says international law applies in the interest of maintaining international peace and security, cooperation, understanding, and so on. And so that is important to understand. Also, it is one of the reasons why we can look, for instance, at environmental law now that we're dealing with so much congestion in outer space. Then we have peaceful uses. I've also alluded to that, but there is also a specific article in the Outer Space Treaty, Article 4, that deals with that. What is stated in Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty is that you can never put a nuclear weapon or another weapon of mass destruction anywhere in outer space. You cannot place them, you cannot test them, you cannot put them on the moon or put them in an orbit or fly them through or whatever. Nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction are prohibited everywhere, always. But again, we do not have a firm definition of weapon of mass destruction. And there is, of course, some case law, the nuclear weapons case and so on of the ICJ that we can use. So there are precedents where we can use that to interpret. But that would also mean nuclear weapons, weapon of mass destruction. So if something is neither a nuclear weapon nor a weapon of mass destruction, it's allowed. So that's why we say outer space is not completely demilitarized. It's partly demilitarized. Because what is prohibited is any kind of weapon on the moon and other celestial bodies. That is what the second part of Article 4 does. So the first part speaks about space in general, and there it is only nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. The second part speaks about the moon and other celestial bodies, the moon, Mars, and Pluto, and asteroids, and what have you. They have to be used for exclusively peaceful purposes. You cannot put military maneuvers or military personnel unless if they're used for scientific purposes. You cannot test weapons. So there's a stronger prohibition of military use on celestial bodies than there is for the rest of outer space. It means that the rest of outer space could be used for military purposes. And you can also bring that back to what I just said, Article 3, international law applies. The United Nations Charter says you should not use force or threaten with the use of force in Article 2, paragraph 4 of the Charter. But if you are aggressed, you can use the right of individual or collective self-defense, Article 51 of the UN Charter. So if you are attacked in outer space, you could apply the UN Charter and defend yourself. And also, there is, of course, all kinds of other military use of outer space, which doesn't mean shooting a gun, but also observation, surveillance, spying, verification. All that is, of course, also military use, which can also contribute to some kind of balance or peace, if you like. And so that's why we say, as I said, space is not completely demilitarized. You do have nowadays more and more states that are creating space forces. Perhaps you've seen the Netflix series Space Force, quite funny. And other countries have done the same. France and Japan and UK have also created branches of their military that are dealing with space, because space is a national security asset. Space is super strategic. If you don't have space, your society falls apart. So it is important that states can protect that. And that's why this whole aspect of military use of outer space is there. And having these space forces, also NATO has said space is part of the domains. United States constantly says space is a domain of warfare. Hopefully it's not. But certainly that increases the tension around the world. And that is, of course, a bit sad. We've also seen several states that have carried out anti-satellite tests. And those are really problematic because they create a lot of debris. Space junk. And so we have China who shoot down its own satellite. America did the same, and India and Russia most recently. And you still have clouds of space junk that are floating around because one state shoots down its own satellite to show that it has capacity to do so, to show its muscles. And that is something that is problematic. What you see now happening actually is that states are making unilateral statements that they will not do any anti-satellite tests anymore. United States started with that a few months ago. And then New Zealand and Japan and UK and Germany. And if more and more states start doing that again, what could we have? The creation of a customary rule that you should not shoot down objects in outer space. If we look at cooperation and mutual assistance, there are several articles in the treaties that deal with that. First important one is in Article 9 that says you should not harmfully interfere with the activities of other states. You should have due regard for the activities of other states. And also you should not harmfully contaminate outer space. So there are two different things here. One is contamination. So you should not bring bacteria to a pristine planet where you spoil the planet for further research. And so you have all kinds of protection measures. If you send a mission to a planet where there might be life or signs of previous life, you have to put everything in a safe container. If you bring something from space back to Earth, you also have to be careful. We call that backward and forward contamination. If you bring dust back from another planet, asteroid to Earth, it could be very harmful for humans, for instance. So you have to contain it and you have to do it in a clean room and so on. So that's what we mean with no contamination. That's different from harmful interference. Harmful interference means I put my satellite just in front of your satellite and then your satellite cannot send its signals anymore. I do not take into account the rules of frequency, assignments, and so on. And that is becoming more and more important now that we have hundreds or thousands of satellites, especially in low Earth orbit, in the orbits below 1,000 kilometers, where it's becoming pretty full. And so not harmfully interference means that you have to coordinate You have to communicate, and you have to take into account each other's interests. And if there is a risk of harmful interference, you are obliged to enter into consultations. So this has not really happened so far. States have not called on each other, hey, you're interfering, I want consultations. But I think that that will become something that will occur in the future, because we have so many actors and so many objects in space now. International cooperation is also in many articles where we say if we discover something, we have to inform the scientific community and the United Nations and the public. We have to allow each other to visit each other's stations. If there is a state that has a station on the moon and another state has another station, then we should say, hello, you're welcome to come and visit. But maybe not today because we're doing some experiment. Please notify me and I'll let you know when you can come. And if you come to see me, I can also come to see you. So it's also on the basis of reciprocity. Of course, this is not yet happening because we don't yet have stations on the moon where, let alone two, where states can go and visit each other. But it is written with foresight in the treaty. What is important, of course, is the provision about assistance to humans. There you have human rights, humanitarian protection that comes in. Astronauts are considered as envoys of mankind. That is Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty. What does that mean? Are they kind of ambassador? Do they get diplomatic protection? Do they get a special passport? Again, we don't really know, but certainly people who have been to outer space, and there is about 500 so far, 600 maybe. They, of course, have a certain ambassador role. They have seen how fragile our Earth is, our planet is from outer space. They see our planet without boundaries, without disputes. And so they go often to schools and they speak with children. They stimulate children to go into STEM studies, math and science and technology and so on. Sorry. My voice is leaving me. And they are, in a way, a kind of envoy of humankind. But also it means that they deserve assistance in case of distress. If an astronaut strands or if he has a hole in his spacesuit or whatever, you have to save him because it's a dangerous atmosphere. And so we need to make sure that they get all the assistance we need, and that is what is written down in Article 5 and in that rescue agreement. So let's move on. Responsibility, liability, and registration. I will deal with them together because they are also the most important principles now in the new space age, because they also have to do with private activities, with that whole advent of commercial activities. States are always responsible for the actions in outer space, including those of their private companies. That is what we call state responsibility for national activities in outer space, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. It means that states have to authorize and permanently supervise the activities of their nationals. And they do that often by making a national law, because then they have a licensing system and they have a legal relation with the national entities, with the companies. It is not an obligation to have a national law. By the way, Indonesia has a national law since 2013. Very extensive law, I think, 100 articles or so. And so about maybe 40 countries or so, not so many, have a national space law. And the most important reason is to govern private activities, but also to lay down procedures and processes and so on. And this is, of course, also becoming more and more difficult because there's more and more actors, more and more interests. You have astronomers who say that their astronomical observations are being disturbed by satellite moving into outer space. So how do you balance those needs of science and commerce? As a state, you are responsible. So you have to find a way to balance those interests. It's not as simple anymore that there is one communication satellites per country. It is different companies, different actors, different countries. And so that becomes a more and more complicated task. It also means that we have to deal with what happens if something goes wrong. Things have gone wrong. We have, of course, had, on the one hand, you cannot see the photos because of the Zoom, but you can maybe share the slides later on. We have had objects that have crashed on Earth, that have re-entered the atmosphere and were so big that they didn't burn up completely and crash somewhere on Earth. But Earth consists for 75% of water. And so most of those have crashed in the oceans, and they have not caused damage to human life. They have caused some damage, surely, but nothing catastrophic. And there has also been collisions in outer space. And because you have to remember, anything that is launched into outer space just stays there. And depending on which height it is, it can stay there for hundreds, thousands of years. But eventually, everything is pulled back to Earth. But especially in those low Earth orbits where you have all these tiny little satellites nowadays with the miniaturization, but there are so many of them, it means that the risk of collision is growing. Not only because there are more active objects, but also because there are so many more pieces of debris. A satellite that is no longer working, there is no obligation, you haven't heard me say, there's an obligation to move your junk out of the way. The Outer Space Treaty does not include any obligation to remove a satellite that no longer works. A satellite in geostationary satellite orbit usually works about 15 years, and then it has to be replaced or repaired or refueled. We now have industries of what we call on-orbit surfacing. It's refueling or repairing, sometimes just a little screw or whatever. If we can do that, we can prolong the life. We don't need to launch a new satellite. But also, there is no obligation to remove your old satellite from the orbit. And there also we have an industry that's happening. That's what we call active debris removal. We have companies, one in Japan, Astroscale, and there is a company in Switzerland, ClearSpace. And their mission is to go with a satellite to grab a piece of debris and to bring it back through the Earth atmosphere to burn up, because small pieces burn up. That's auto-clean. So we have also industry doing that, but we don't have an obligation. And so as long as there's no obligation, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to do that? So we need rules. We need rules for that. But anyway, we have basic liability rules that say launching states are liable for damage caused by their space object. And the concept of launching state is defined quite broadly. Different states can be seen as launching state. You see it there. The one who launches, the one who procures, the one whose territory or facility is used. And because there is now more and more different states, different entities in different states that are involved, it means that different states can qualify as launching state. And so you can claim your damage from any of those. But you is not you personally, it is a state. It's a state-based system. So if you get a satellite that crashes on your house, you cannot go and find out who's the launching state and put a claim. No, you will have to go to your Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who has to present a claim to the ministry of one of the launching states and present the claim on your behalf. And that has never happened. We don't have any case law of space law. No International Court of Justice case to interpret these principles. The damage that is covered, life, health, damage to property, either whether it's caused in space or on the Earth or in the air, is covered. It's different when damage happens in space. It is a fault liability. You have to prove fault. If something crashes on Earth, you don't have to prove fault. There's an absolute liability. So we have an extensive system of liability rules. Registration, I can be short about that. I already mentioned that whatever is launched into space has to be registered both in a national registry and in the UN registry. You can actually go to the website of the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs and find the public registry of objects. You just type in your country, for instance, Indonesia, and you will see which satellites have been entered into that registry by your country. And you can see some things that are entered in green and between brackets. That means they have not been officially registered, officially notified by a launching state, but they have been notified, for instance, by the launching authority. You nowadays have launch providers who can launch up to 100 satellites in one launch. And so they will usually inform the UN, we've launched this and this and this and this and this. That means they are not officially registered with the UN. For that to happen, the state who wants to claim jurisdiction and control over the satellite, who wants to exercise jurisdiction and control, has to officially register the satellite. And as I said earlier, that practice is not always followed to the letter. And so you see a lot of informal registrations, if you like, on that public registry. And then lastly, commercial use of outer space. Well, I will go back into that when I discuss a little bit the space resources. And I mentioned the main feature of that. It deals with the commercial use of space and resources. It also prescribes that we should establish a certain regime for carrying out those activities, which makes good sense. If you read that treaty, it's actually not at all a bad treaty that would definitely merit more ratifications, but it has that common heritage of mankind principle, the CHM principle, which I mentioned. As a consequence, and because the industry started to become interested, we see that states have been issuing national law. The United States started with that in 2015. They issued a law that says, okay, it's uncertain under international law, but when our companies are going to be able to do this activity, they will be allowed to own the resources. You remember what I told you about Article 2, non-appropriation, that we don't have really the answer whether resources can be owned. The moon cannot be owned, but can the water be owned? So because that is not clearly addressed in space law, some states have made national law. So in a way, they are interpreting international law through national law. And that is an interesting concept. And some states rightfully say that that is not the ideal solution to interpret international law. That was adopted by consensus in an international body. So ideally, we should have an interpretation through that international body. I'll say a bit more about that when we discuss that. National space legislation. I mentioned that Article 6 with responsibility. States are responsible for their national activities. They have to authorize and supervise. So they do that often by making national law. But their national law is also a translation of their national space policy. Policy and law are always closely related, and a state has a certain policy. For instance, it wants to boost innovation and attract lots of space companies. Then it will make a different space law from a country that says, oh, it's dangerous and I prefer to keep them out and I keep control myself. Then your national law will be much more restrictive, will have higher fees or more difficult to get a license and so on. And so it's always policy first, and you translate that into law. But you also use that national law to fulfill your duties under the treaties. Your duty under the treaty is to authorize and supervise. How are you going to do that? And you're going to do that through your national law, where you have a licensing system. So what you will see as a bare minimum in any national space law, and you can check your law, I don't know if it's been translated, still not yet. 10 years ago, you have to translate that, new project. Has to be done. You will anyway find Article 6, Article 7, Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty in there. authorization and supervision. So how do states get a license? They need to, for instance, go through an audit. You have to check their technical, financial credibility, stuff like that. You have to make sure that as a state, you cover the risk of being held liable. So you're going to tell the private company to get insurance against third-party liability. And you're going to put in the license that the company has to pay back the state if the state is held liable, because it's the state that's going to be held liable. It's not the company. It is the launching state that is liable for damage caused in outer space or on the Earth by a space object. So the state really has to cover their tracks. If they're going to allow private activity, it is wise to have a licensing system where you say you have to get insurance and you have to pay me back if I get a claim. And then registration. Registration is a duty of the state. Certain parameters of the satellite have to be notified to the UN, where the satellite is, what is its purpose, and so on. So you have to make sure through your national law also that you get that information from the private actor. And so those are really, I would say, the minimum requirements for any national law. And now we're going into the exciting stuff, new space. This is a buzzword, new space. And the buzzwords that go with it are faster, better, cheaper. Space was a state activity. It was, as I said, US, Russia, then more countries, and then more and more countries, and then private entities. And now it is all these space pioneers who can do everything faster, better, cheaper. Of course, they do that with the help of the state. Let's not make a mistake. Even SpaceX of Elon Musk gets money from NASA to develop its rockets and do its activities. It is not from one day to the other, we move from state-based activity to completely private activities. There is a transition. But there is certainly a transition from the state taking care of everything to making it more efficient by bringing in private companies. And that is certainly a good development because it also helps to democratize space, which is, sorry, again, a buzzword. But it does also make things more complicated. It does also mean that we have to make sure to follow the rules and to implement the rules and to make sure that that regime, that system that we have established over the first half century of space activity, that somehow is preserved and maintained. And so it is bringing opportunities, but it also brings challenges. And what you see there on the photos, one example is space resource utilization, another is miniaturization of satellites. Now you can make what we call CubeSats, a cube of 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter. That small can be your satellite that provides communication services, navigation, Internet of Things, and all that. Constellations on that third image, you see we put in low Earth orbit a constellation of small satellites. We don't put a big, expensive satellite in geostationary satellite orbit, which is, as I said, 36,000 kilometers. Those are big, expensive satellites. They have to go very far in outer space. They have to work for 15 years. That's completely different from constellations of CubeSats, which go to within 300 to 800 kilometers, and where you just launch many small satellites, which are cheaper, easier to launch, easier to replace because they're standardized. And so that really makes a big difference. And then also we're going to send, we have already been sending private humans into outer space. Who would like to go to outer space? Not so many. Yeah, you said already. You would go to Mars even. I'm surprised, not so many. I mean, if you would, of course, be given the money and the ticket, because I know it's going to be very expensive, but still, okay, there are many people who have already bought tickets. I said earlier, there have been about 600 people to outer space. More than that have bought tickets. So like in a year or two, this will be a completely different landscape. And there, that question of astronauts as envoys of mankind, you know, that becomes interesting because is there a hierarchy between Paris Hilton, who buys a ticket to space, or Neil Armstrong? You know, are they the same envoys of mankind? Do they deserve the same protection, the same status? How do we make sure that these people do not endanger the International Space Station by doing something stupid because they haven't been in training for 6 months or 4 years or whatever? So this will also create a lot of interesting questions. So I'm going to mention just a few activities, and then I'm going to stop and rest my voice and let you ask me questions. So think about them. One activity is, and I mentioned that several times, space resource activities. I think this is really an important step, an important milestone. We know that there is water on the moon, and that is, if you listen to scientists, that is the most important and interesting resource for the time being. Of course, there are also stories about we can find helium-3 and we bring that back to Earth, and then we can solve our energy problem. We have so many problems with now being dependent on Russian gas, for instance. We could solve everything if we could bring back helium-3. First of all, we don't have fusion energy yet. We cannot use it yet. Second of all, it is going to be very difficult and very expensive to bring back stuff from outer space. And to make that economically interesting, because you have to launch from the moon before even extracting, or are you going to make a pipeline or whatever, that is still several decades away, I would estimate. There are also people who say we can find platina on asteroids, but asteroids are very volatile. It's difficult to land on it. You have to somehow grab it and then mine it and whatever. What are you going to do with it? Interesting, but maybe in a few years. However, water on the moon. Water on the moon is really interesting because you can sustain a human presence, you can grow food, and you can transform water into fuel. So it means you can use the fuel you can fabricate on the moon or in lunar orbit to go to Mars. Which means you don't have to bring all the energy from Earth, which is super expensive. Every kilo that you send up to outer space is very, very expensive. So if you don't have to do that, that is a game changer for going to Mars. And Mars is very interesting because it has gravity. It also has radiation. It has many problems, but I'm sure if you've seen The Martian or other movies, you will know that one day humanity will be setting up shop on Mars. I'm pretty convinced of that. So what is the legal value of owning that water? Does that fall or not under Article 2, that non-appropriation principle? And that was a discussion that has been going on for the past 5-7 years or so, when, as I said, the United States issued a national law in 2015. Immediately 3 months later, UN-COPUOS adopted an agenda item. I've never seen an agenda item adopted so quickly. Within 5 minutes, there was consensus, because also you need consensus on the agenda. And so that has been on the agenda. Okay, it's on the agenda. It probably means it's going to be there for at least 10 years. And the last soft law instrument that was adopted by consensus is the long-term sustainability guidelines that took 10 years. Agenda item was adopted in 2016, was discussed for the first time in 2017, and only now in 22 actually, just this year, it took 5 years to agree on the creation of a working group with a mandate for 5 years. And so at the end of that, we will be at that 10 years to discuss the governance of space resource activities. And so everybody realizes this is an opportunity, but also a challenge. We have to get it right. And we have to ensure that it doesn't become a gold rush and doesn't become a race to the bottom. We have to make sure that the use and exploration are the province of all mankind. It has to be equitable, it has to be shared. The benefit of all humankind has to be preserved. And that is probably the biggest challenge, because of course you have private entities who are interested in doing this, And states will have to authorize and supervise. And so they will have to come with a system to ensure that there is some form of sharing, whatever it may be. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to divide every dollar of profit into 193 parts. Can be also capacity building, sharing of data, what have you, but it's difficult. So you have to make sure that we find a way to do this equitably and then enforce that also on those private companies. So what did I write there? I think I sort of addressed all that. So the national laws, yes, I mentioned the US, but after the US, also Luxembourg did the same. They also made such a law in 2017. Japan did it, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, did it. The UAE in 2019 and Japan in 2021. So recent, and this is so far 4 or 5 countries, and they are more or less the same. But if we're going to have later on 25, 50 different national laws, one state saying it's allowed and another saying it's not allowed, that's not ideal. And everybody knows that. And also those countries know that. And so those laws all say we will comply with the Outer Space Treaty. And so that's why I say this is their interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. They say the Outer Space Treaty does not per se prohibit the ownership of natural resources. And I think I agree with that, because it wouldn't make sense to say if there's water on the moon, no one can own it or use it. That would not bring the great prospects of space to humankind. The only thing is we have to find a way to do it right. And that's the challenge for you guys. Constellations of satellites, that's another thing that creates a lot of opportunities as well as challenges. I mentioned it earlier. You have Elon Musk, who wants to launch 42,000 satellites, 42,000 satellites. There are currently about 3,000 working satellites in orbit. Already half of them are his. And every time he launches 60 in a row in one launch, 1 per week, it goes on and on and on. I don't know if he needs 42,000 to do what he's doing. His mission is to provide internet to everyone on the world. That's, of course, also useful. There are still many areas on the globe that don't have, where citizens don't have access to internet. And the digital divide still exists. But on the other hand, does he really need 42,000? Up to national governments to assess that. Because so many small satellites will disturb astronomical observations, as I said. And you have these photos of trains of satellites that go through the sky, and observation of stars is disturbed. And that is also important because that teaches us about our universe, about our history. And so we have to find a way to deal with that. Congestion is growing. So many satellites, there's going to be collisions, more and more. So how do we stop that? How do we deal with that? How do we register so many satellites? You have to fill in a form of 4 pages long for every satellite. How are you going to do that for 42,000 satellites? And how is the staff of the UN office going to deal with that? There are 25 people. And it's not only SpaceX, you also have other companies who are doing the same. So you need to also make sure that these new actors know that there is space law, that they have to have due regard, that they should avoid collisions, that they should be sustainable. Sustainability is, of course, a big thing. And we need traffic rules. Like you have air traffic management, the control tower that says you can go land and you take off, and that makes sure that there's no collisions in airspace. We don't have that for space. So space traffic management is another interesting topic for your research. It's also a topic on the agenda of the legal subcommittee of COPUOS. And we don't have those rules. Who's going to make them? Who is going to enforce them? Which institution do we put in charge? What are the rules? Priority to the right, to the left? Who goes out of the way if there is a collision avoidance warning? But we can track what's going on. And so there can be expectations of some possible collision. But if you have to go out the way, you use your fuel up. So it means your satellite has less useful lifetime. And so that costs. And so how do we decide who goes out of the way? It's another interesting topic. Private human spaceflight. I mentioned in the beginning, those companies that do suborbital flight. So suborbital means they don't go in an orbit. You have there on the picture Virgin Galactic, which is a plane under which a little rocket plane hangs, and it takes off like a plane, and then at some height, the rocket plane takes off, there's an ignition, and it goes to that 80, 90, 100 kilometers. And it can carry, I think, 6 passengers or so. That is Richard Branson's toy, if you like, or his project. And on the other hand, you have Blue Origin, which is a little vertical rocket that goes up and comes down by a parachute. And they both flew commercial passengers after working on this for 15 years or so. They both flew for the first time commercial passengers last summer. So in July 21. So that is, of course, super exciting that that is happening. I mean, it's still very expensive. I think $200,000-300,000 or something. And you are, 3 minutes in space, and you can unbuckle and you can float and you can see the Earth from space. And so that is, of course, probably life-changing. But what is it? Is it aviation or is it space flight? Are the passengers protected by Montreal Convention on Liability of Air Carriers? Or if an accident happened, does a state have to claim under the Liability Convention for space activities? We still don't know. For now, this activity is taking place in the United States, clear. They take off from the US, they go up there, they come down in the desert, and they land again on US territory. So national law applies, and the US has made national rules which sort of are interesting, because any passenger that buys such a ticket and that goes up there has to sign what we call an informed consent. They have to say, I know what I'm doing is risky, and I accept that risk. I don't know about Indonesia, but in Europe, that wouldn't really work. We're much more risk averse. And we want the passenger to be protected. We want the vehicle to be certified. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. We also now have orbital flights. So actually passengers going to the International Space Station. We had the first of those already in 2001, Dennis Tito, a South African, who went 10 days to ISS. But now, most recently, we had a fully commercial crew, so not even a NASA astronaut as the commander, but that's the picture that you see on the bottom right. Fully commercial crew that went to ISS and spent time there. And so you have also all kinds of other missions that you see there, where philanthropists, rich people, billionaires, they have all kinds of plans, and they do charity missions and auctions and what have you. And Tom Cruise is going to make a movie on the ISS. The ISS is an international space station. There's going to be international commercial space station with Axiom. Axiom is an American company. So all this is going to happen, and you can go on a trip to space. So that is probably a little bit more expensive, 60, 70 million or something, out of my reach, out of maybe your reach as well. But still, still interesting. I'm coming to the last few slides here. I want to emphasize a little bit still before I close these concerns about environmental issues and sustainability, because I do think that that is one of the big challenges that we have to address. And so we have, as I said, more and more activities. You also have more and more tensions. You have these anti-satellite tests, and we do not have clear rules. The only point of attachment in the Outer Space Treaty that we have is that non-harmful interference principle in Article 9. You should have due regard for the activities of others, and if there is a risk of harmful interference, you have to consult. There's not even a prohibition of harmful interference. The only thing is that if there is a risk of harmful interference, you have to consult. We don't have a definition of what is debris. There's no difference between an active or an inactive object. What about a little piece of paint? it can cause major damage because of the absence of gravity. Even a very small piece can make a hole in a window of ISS, of the space station. And so very small objects also have the problem that they are very hard to track. So you cannot know where they are. Something has to be ideally larger than 10 centimeters in diameter to be able to be tracked. And then you have all kinds of, you see some numbers on the slides there. So this is a growing problem. And there are even some who say, even without a collision, you're going to have a self-perpetuating collision effect, which is called the Kessler syndrome, named after Don Kessler, who came with these calculations. And so we do have, okay, Article 9, no harm for interference, but we do have also two sets of important soft law principles. On the one hand, the space debris mitigation guidelines, which say you should try to not break up on purpose your object. You should make sure that it doesn't stay too long in orbit after its useful life, but they are not legally binding. However, you see those often translated into national law. I know, for instance, in my country, in the Netherlands, we oblige operators to remove their object after a maximum of 25 years after launch. And this is, again, a non-written rule. It has become sort of practice. And very interestingly, the United States FCC, Federal Communications Commission, has recently decided to reduce that, what we call 25-year rule, to 5 years. So in the US now, you have to make sure that your satellite is deorbited, for instance, by using one of those new industries or having a deorbiting mechanism or whatever, after 5 years after its useful life. So that might make a difference. Huh? We have to, on Earth also, we learned to clean up plastics and all these things that pollute our planet not so long ago. And in space also, in the beginning, everybody just launched fun. Let's launch something in space. Space is big, but it is getting more and more contested and congested. And that is a problem. And so we have also the long-term sustainability guidelines, which is a set of 21 guidelines to preserve also for future generations, for you guys, outer space, of which we're all so dependent. And so these guidelines, again, have to be implemented at national level. You see again that importance of national legislation, which also means that your national legislation should not be static. And you should also, your law is 10 years old, maybe you should have another look at it. I know that in the Netherlands, we're doing that now. Are we compliant with those most recent long-term sustainability guidelines? Do we cover all that? It's 21 guidelines with all kinds of sub-guides and 150 points or something. It's a huge document. Okay, conclusions. I think that the space law, I hope I have shown to you that there is a basic system of rules and principles of behavior that have been adopted and that are being observed, that states do comply with, but also there are new developments and where we see sometimes fragmentation, national law happening, where we do need some global coordination. And so we do need general rules of the road. We need equitable sharing. We need to make sure that we have also intergenerational equity, long-term sustainability, and also these new uses of space, even though it's maybe okay to have some development of national laws to some extent. At some point, it has to converge and we have to discuss. And you see that also with all these countries that made those national laws, they do also contribute and participate in the international fora, such as the UN COPUOS. So sometimes you hear criticism, COPUOS is too slow and too long and too political. And yes, it is slow and long and political, especially now, unfortunately, it has become very politicized. But it is the only place where states all come together to discuss these issues. And so I hope that we will continue to be able to do so. I just had a slide about Leiden, just to say that that is the law school where Alif studied and where we have been teaching space law since nearly the start of the space age. And we have an institute since 1985 and a master program since 2000. which is Air Law and Space Law. It's a 1-year English language master, which you can study face-to-face, or for those who are already working, there's also a blended learning version where you don't have to be in Leiden, but that's for people more in their professions. We have also bachelor course and PhDs and visiting researchers and a library. And maybe one day I will be seeing some of you in the master, and happy to be in touch. And I think I'll end it there and see if there's any questions. And thank you for listening so far.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Tanya, for your presentation about the space law and how it regulates states' activities outside of national jurisdiction. So now we have more than 30 minutes to question and answer. Do you have any questions from the students?
Good afternoon, Professor Tanya. Pleased to meet you. Thank you so much for this opportunity here. I guess for my first question is more of a grounded one. You say that the limit between airspace and outer space is not clearly defined. And it got me thinking about weapons. Could a country specifically put nuclear weapons in a suborbital orbit and argues that it is in their airspace, not in their outer space? Wouldn't that not break the outer space treaty and the militarization of it?
Well, something is either in orbit or it's not in orbit. So a suborbital orbit doesn't exist. And so you're either in an orbit, it means you have enough orbital velocity to stay floating and not be drawn back to Earth, or you are suborbital, so you don't have enough velocity and you go up and down. If you would place a nuclear weapon in your airspace, that would also be prohibited by other treaties, such as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and case law of the UN and so on. So I would say that the placement of nuclear weapons is probably an erga omnes obligation, regardless of where you would place such a weapon.
That actually helped me sleep more right now.
Sorry?
It will help me sleep knowing that.
Good.
Well, I have a few more questions, but I think I'm give a chance to the other students.
Sure.
Good afternoon, Professor Tanya. I'm Nadila Mahila Veda. I have a question. It's about the third companies regulation. Now there are space companies that provide space tourism. If you have money, you can go to the space. So what happened? Let's say that when they are flying out of the space, that spaceship will attack and explode. Because of that, no one survived. So when something like that happens, whose responsibility is it? Is it fall into a state responsibility or strictly that company's responsibility or the side that attacked that ship? And who will get the compensation for it? I think that's all for my question, Professor Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting question, a challenging question. And actually, I would advise that you become a member of a team of the Manfred Laks Moot for Court competition, because this is typically a case for a moot court competition. I leave you have a member of your team already. This is, of course, a futuristic scenario of having a private spaceship with paying passengers on board, and then it's shut down by someone, and what happens? And that is what I raised earlier. Is there a difference between private persons in space and professional astronauts in space? Should there be? Should we only defend professional astronauts, or is there a humanitarian principle of you said everyone died, but let's suppose someone lives and has to be rescued. Then maybe we should say the private astronaut also deserves to be rescued because of humanitarian principles, right? Is there a hierarchy like on a ship? The captain leaves the ship last. Should you first save the passengers and then the captain? And that is all things that we don't know. If the ship is destroyed, the spaceship, and there is damage, and the operator of that ship wants to get compensation, it will probably have to go to its state that licensed it, because there's no private space activity without a state behind it. Authorization, supervision, always a state that is responsible. So it can go to their state and say, hey, you have to make a claim against whoever shot down my spaceship. So that the damage can be compensated. Let's hope it doesn't get there. It sounds like a Star Wars scenario.
I see. Thank you, Professor. I think I will think twice now if I have money to go into space tourism.
Well, I wouldn't go unless I know it is safe to. I am with you.
Maybe in the long run, they will extend the applicability of the Montreal Convention to space
Well,
flights.
if you talk about passenger protection, that is definitely what we have to have is special rules for protecting the passengers. It is a state-based regime, and that will not work if we have passengers in outer space. And we're definitely going to have to support this industry, because that will also allow me to come to Indonesia in 3 hours instead of 15 hours, because we will use A to B on Earth via suborbital space as the next stage in aviation. So is that spaceflight? Is it aviation? We have to come with answers. And I think we need some rules from both regimes. And so I would say we need a sui generis, a special regime for suborbital flight in the future. For now, it will probably be a mix of both regimes, I think.
So next question, and the questions from the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, Professor. I would like to ask a question regarding cooperation and mutual assistance. It is written that there shall no be harmful contamination of space. So what about efforts to make a planet, for example, Mars, to be habitable for humans? Does it still counts as contamination of space, even though if it's done for the sake of humanity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's also an interesting question. Would making Mars habitable mean that we contaminate it? I'm not so sure, because we would have to live in pods or something, because there's lots of radiation, dangerous radiation. So I don't know if we would bring dangerous contaminants to Mars, but that is something that we should try to avoid. And there's I'm sorry, I'm referring again to movies or TV series, but I think they can be quite enlightening. There's an interesting series called The Expanse. I don't know if you have seen that, but there is a scientist who wants to use samples and do research to find proof of water, proof of life on Mars. And there's another company and they want to drill water because they want to sell it. And so they are fighting with each other. You have to wait for me first to do my experiments before you drill the water. And then they go ahead anyway. And so once you spoil it for all of humanity. So you have an organization called COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, which makes a planetary protection protocol. The COSPAR Planetary Protection Protocol has been observed by states ever since the space age. So the space agencies, they apply these protocols with different rules according to where you go in space. So for instance, Mars has a higher protection degree than the moon, where there's no life. And also depending on whether you do a flyby or whether you land or whether you want to bring back samples. So there's a variety of rules that apply. However, again, once we are going to have private, when Elon Musk is going to Mars, are we also able to make sure that he will apply the planetary protection principles? So there was actually one first license given to a private company in the United States, to Moon Express, that wants to send a rover to the moon. And so that was the first license for a private mission to another celestial body. And they were asked in their license analysis, in their payload review, to comply with the planetary protection principles. So I think that we will find a way to ensure that that is also done in the future to avoid both harmful contamination backwards and forwards. We will have to find a way to do that. So we have to do it in a sustainable, non-contaminating manner.
all clear.
Okay, thank you, Jacob, for your question. Do you still have any more questions?
No, thank you, Professor.
So, Professor, I think we have another question in the Zoom chat. Mas Deden from BRIN. Mas Deden, would you like to deliver a question directly?
I can read it also, or you want to speak?
Hello, Mas Deden, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, there I see you.
You're still muted, I think, Mas Deden.
Are we mute? Do you hear us? I see you.
Hi, Mas Deden, you're still muted. Can you unmute your?
You are muted, yeah.
Huh?
Oh, he's not allowed. Oh, you have to
Ah.
allow him to unmute. We're experts in Zoom, but we always have problems still. Huh?
Yeah. Okay, now can you? Yeah.
I believe I can be
Ah.
heard.
Okay, hi.
Hi, I'm Dr. Tanya. Welcome to Indonesia. Actually, I'm Indonesian, but now, good morning from Leicester,
Hi,
England.
good morning.
So actually, I come closer to you, but you come further to Indonesia. Firstly, I would like to congratulate you for being elected as a new IAF Vice President. Well deserved, given your decades of contributions to this field. I'm currently a PhD research student at University of Leicester, studying space policies, especially from developing countries' point of view. So before study as a LAPAN's employee, BRIN now, I've been involved in preparing Indonesian statements in UN Corpus Forum, so the questions would be around it. Actually, I have many of questions, including the reason why the Netherlands became one of few countries that signed and ratified the Moon Treaty. But however, I will be general now and rather put a question. Is it good to replace consensus or current decision-making methods in general in negotiating space law, given the increasing complexity of the diplomatic deliberations on space law, increasing actors, activities, huge number of member states in COPUOS, as well as forums outside on UN COPUOS? As far as I know, we also have conference on disarmament talking about space treaties, especially in military terms, and International Telecommunication Union, because Indonesia deal with many issues around geostationary orbit. At this rate, I think it will be more problems to come, but less solutions for it. As you mentioned, discussion on guidelines on LTS took years to have consensus. So yeah, how about that? How's your opinion on it, Dr. Tanya? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very fair question, and it is raised with some regularity. Should we let go of the consensus principle and go to a voting system? Yes, it took 10 years, but 10 years brought us consensus on long-term sustainability. For space resources or space traffic management, it may also take 10 or 5 years or whatever. But if you strive for that, if you continue to strive for that, you have something that is agreed by everyone. And I agree that then you have something called the lowest common denominator, right? You do not have, maybe you have a very high aim, but then after all the negotiations and all the talk, you end with the lowest achievable. That is a problem on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think it is so valuable that we should absolutely strive to preserve it. And it is more difficult not only because of the quantity of the actors, but also because of the political issues or the group forming. You have some states who will always follow what their group says. You have the regional groups in the UN. If you're going to a system of voting, I'm afraid that you're going to have different rules applied to different states. And that is, especially in an area like outer space, where you all operate in a sovereign free domain, really not ideal. So I think that having the rule of consensus probably also means that states make a better effort at finding that consensus. And if they know that there is a possibility to also just go with a vote, then we'll just go with votes, and well, you see what's happening in the Security Council or in the General Assembly and so on. So I think it is a very valuable concept, and I would do anything I could to help preserve it. Would you agree, or do you think we should let it go?
Actually, I agree, because Indonesia has power with consensus method, actually, even small, but you know, yeah, the issue is growing, but less decisions on it. I feel there is no point of Indonesia has voice on it if other nations, especially the spacefaring one, because Indonesia, among other issues, among many issues in UN Corpus, we focused on two questions: definition, delimitation of outer space, and geostationary orbit. We focus on these two problems, among others, and it's hard for us to make a strong statements that can be heard by nations that can do more in outer space.
Yeah, because those are typically topics where we haven't found consensus in nearly 50 years, and I'm not too optimistic we will find it. And I fully understand the importance for Indonesia of those two topics, but maybe it is also interesting or time to look at those other topics like space traffic management or equitable use of resources or stuff like that, which are perhaps more practical, more pragmatic, less political than those two topics that you mentioned. I'm not too optimistic that we will ever find a consensus on those, but I also don't think that voting on those will be the solution.
And lastly, maybe back to the Netherlands one, because I'm very curious.
Why did we ratify the Moon Agreement?
Yeah. Why the Netherlands?
Well, because we are a country that is very fond of international law. As you know, we are the home country of Hugo Grotius, the father of the law of the sea. And we still believe that the Moon Treaty is a good treaty. And we still think that, we still hope that more states will be ratifying it. But we also think that there may be other ways of finding agreement. And so we have created the Hague Working Group on Space Resource, the building blocks, which you've perhaps heard of. We might also join the Artemis Accords. The political agreement that the NASA is concluding with other countries to participate in the Artemis program to bring humans back to the moon, and we do not think that that is incompatible. There are several countries who have done that. Australia, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia are also parties to the Moon Agreement and have also acceded to Artemis Accords. And so sometimes we got the question also, why do you make that Hague Working Group on building blocks if you are a party to the Moon Agreement? And then we say, yeah, the Moon Agreement obliges us to make a regime. We try, we consult with the states parties. I actually worked with a guy in the ministry at some point to draft a regime. And we brought that into the member states of the Moon Treaty, and we discussed that. And we were nearly there, but then there were two countries who said, yeah, let us have another look at it. And they took it and they went, and then somehow the momentum was lost and the regime didn't make it. But we think that if you read the Moon Agreement, which says we have to make a regime that is equitable, rational management, and that means you take into account the interests of all stakeholders, it's not a bad treaty. And that whole problem of the common heritage of mankind, the treaty literally says, as it finds its expression in this agreement. So with the states members, you can find an agreement on how to interpret it so that it is not the negative concept that it has become just because of, I think, a lot of misunderstanding and bad rhetoric. I hope that explains a bit.
Well, no, really, it's very illuminating. Actually, we try to incorporate common heritage of mankind in our JSO argument, but
maybe we should just find another name for it or something. Maybe we should just find a less.
But thank you, Dr. Tanja.
You're welcome.
Thank you for leading as a nation, as scholars. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Mas Deden, for the question. Hopefully you will finish your PhD soon and be finishing the Indonesian national space policy. So I think the question from Mas Deden and the following discussion is the last question, since it's already 4 p.m. For those of you who still have some question, you can email it to me, and then I will try to email it to Prof.
Yeah, I
If
put
it's
my
fine.
email also on the
Yeah.
slide, so feel free to.
Okay, so if there is no more question from the students, I want to say thank you to Prof. Tanya for giving us your time.
I want to make a selfie.
Of course, yeah.
Hey,
Can you please gather on this side?
do we have everyone? Wait, I have to go through. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, wait. Everybody done? Oh, yeah, come closer, then we have everyone. I'm really not good at making selfies. My children do that better. Or maybe we make one with you guys. Maybe we do one. Yeah, okay. And also do. Wait, I do one first, I do. Can I go?
Okay, everyone is first. 1, 2, 3. Okay, once more. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Once again. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
So thank you all for attending, and don't forget, we're still going to cover other territories next week. And we're still going to dive more on the outer space law for the air and space class. Thank you, Prof. Tanya, for giving us the time. And also thank you for the other participants in the Zoom. Hopefully we'll see each other in the next public lecture. Thank you.